Hi, in this video we're going to talk about network data and how it works in Android, and then I'll prepare you for a tutorial that's to follow. So there are three things that we're going to examine in this video. We're going to talk about what a REST API is, then we're going to talk about how to program what's called asynchronous code, and then finally we'll talk about the Volley library. So REST API is a term that you'll see in programming languages everywhere. It's really about clients and servers. The API stands for something called an application program interface. And really in plain English, it means that there's a server somewhere that's providing data to the client. So that way you have either phones, computers, or watches, or something out there that is relying on a service on the internet. In the following videos, we're going to create a tutorial in Android using a REST API from the service called metaweather.com. And so we're going to have a service that looks like this, where it provides you with a weekly forecast. And it will be up to us to design the user interface so that that data comes out and looks good. So a REST API is a service that lets you look at specific URLs, such as the address that you see listed here. And instead of responding with an HTML page, a web page, you get back a pure data form. So it looks something like this here, where it says London, city, and an ID number. So REST APIs and microservices are two terms that often appear together. So sometimes a development team will break up an application into pieces, into micro pieces, you might say. And they use APIs to talk between those pieces. So a server can usually be split up into tasks. So this is a traditional model you might see. So we have at the bottom, we have a database, we have a data interface, we have a business logic, and then the user interface, a multi-tiered approach. Well, in microservices, you might say, well, that one data interface is actually could be split up into multiple pieces, and we'll call them microservices. Microservices can talk directly to the user interface, or they might provide data to other microservices. So that way you can have a modular approach to building your program. The link between those is the API. So the text messages that are traded between clients and servers are usually done in two different languages. One is Json and the other is XML. There are others, but those are the two most common. So this is what JSON data looks like. You can see that this is a weather report. And you can also see that it is very easily understood when you look at it. It tells you what the ID number is, the type of weather that's for the day. You can see the minimum temperatures, the maximums. It's pretty much readable as a human would be able to see it. But you can also see that there are specific quotations and colons, and so it's a very data delimited piece of text. Now, the same data could have been created in an XML format. And so the XML format looks a little bit like you just expect a web page. It's a hypertext. It's got these brackets and an open and enclosed tag. And so they're not exactly doing the exact same process. XML has a little bit more functions to it. And it's not as popular either. So most people are working on the left side here with JSON data in their APIs. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it can be configured to send messages in not just JSON formats. APIs can be in others. But usually JSON is the type of data that you would expect to see. It's really common. And despite its name, JSON is not limited to JavaScript. So JSON can be used in many different programming languages. So if REST is associated with JSON, then the terminology SOAP is usually associated with XML. So SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. It's very similar to REST, but you can only see XML data when it comes to SOAP. So you could see JSON being used with REST and XML being used with SOAP, but they're both pretty much producing the same results here. They're both trying to communicate text messages to a client. So let's talk a minute about the client and the server. So the client's job is usually the one that says, I will initiate the request. I will ask for some data, and the results will be sent back into the format that the client can understand. So we're going to follow this video with a tutorial that will show you how to use the client for Android. So your client could be a phone, it could be a desktop, it could be a watch, it could be another server, but the client and server is just kind of a generic way to think about it. So that we will use a phone here in our example, but in other cases we could just as easily have programmed this as a web page. So what does an API look like? So the REST service usually has some kind of an endpoint that provides access to the client. So in this example, we have a URL from the website metaweather.com API location and then a location number. And then what follows from that is the weather report for that specific ID number, which happens to be the City of London. And so in a traditional web page, you would, at the green part of the stack of items, you would have said this is the web page. In a REST service, we would say the URL endpoint is not a web page, it's just pure text, and then the client is responsible to format that text into the proper user interface. So how much work does it take to create a backend? Does it have to be written in Android? Does it have to be written in Java? What's the language? Well, the truth is, it doesn't matter what the language is. And server applications can be written in PHP, C#, they could be written in Java, Node, they could be written in Ruby, Python, pretty much any language that can create text files and communicate with a network is going to be eligible to make REST services. So the middle part here and the business logic can be any language that you choose. It's pretty much irrelevant. And so your teams sometimes are split up as a back-end developer and a front-end developer, and that's thanks to the ability to create these APIs that can bridge the gap between the front and the back end. Now, since there is such a nice standard with Json, you can format the data to be output no matter what language that you're working with. And so we have no idea what metaweather.com used as their back end, whether it was Java, C# or something else. Now think about the amount of effort. So the UI, the user interface in the front end, approximately takes about half of the amount of effort that it would take in the back end. Of course, that's determined by the complexity of your application. Sometimes the back end is really the secret sauce of an app, and that's what would take the majority of the time. So if you're interested in learning how to create the back end, I have other tutorials, classes on PHP, classes on Java, classes on C#, and all of those using their frameworks and their full stack will allow you to see how to create the database and then the URLs that are providing these services to you. But for the sake of it's going to follow here, we're going to create an Android application that is going to use a pre-existing free open source API. So we will only do half the work really for this weather app. Another feature that you're going to see in this application tutorial is that there is the idea of asynchronous code. Now, in most examples of coding, you're probably used to seeing synchronous code. That means one line follows the other. You can trace through exactly the order of statements in a program. However, with callbacks or asynchronous code, we have an external process going on. And that's why in network programming here, the idea of asynchronous or callbacks is going to be super important. So let's take an example here. So I have some code in this gray box, and its function says, get me some data. And it says, I want to go to a website, a URL, an API, let's say, and I want to get some user data. So it looks like we're looking for user number 99. Now, that's going to take some time because of the network traffic, and it's could be on the other side of the world. It might take a couple of seconds for that response to happen. And so we're not going to sit around and wait for it. We're going to jump right into the next item in the program. So we're going to continue running. That's the synchronous mode. And we're going to just forget about our network request and let him catch up later. Now, that catch up later process is called the callback. And so when the process is done, there will be an alert sent to your application that says, hey, data's arrived, and what do you want to do with it? So the callback function will have a parameter, like a list or some kind of a string or something, and that will say, hey, I got the data back from the server, and now in this red processing box here, you can go ahead and process that data. It means you can save it to the database or display it to the user or whatever your choice is. But the callback is going to occur at some later time. And we're not sure if it's going to be a millisecond later or a minute later, but it will be a delay. So let's take a look at actually some of the code that we're going to develop here. So we are going to define a callback function, and it will run after a set of data has successfully been retrieved from an online service. And so here's what it's going to look like. We're going to have a button click for get weather by name. And we are going to call this service called the weather service. And it's going to get the forecast. So it's some function, and it's an asynchronous function. So following that, we're going to have two options. So when this is done, we are going to have a on error. That's a possibility that nothing came back, or it was badly formatted. Or we're going to have a response. And you can see in the response that I am updating an array adapter. So I'm showing a list on my UI. So this is the actual Java code that we're going to be coding in a tutorial in the next video. So this asynchronous process is going to help us with what's called non-blocking code. So non-blocking code is to allow other tasks in an application to continue running and not block up the user interface. So you can see in the example in this timeline here that we, in the first example, would be a synchronous execution. So we stop all processing and wait for a response. However, in the second example below, you can see that we are going to start the external process, the network request, but then we're going to go on and do other things. We're going to keep processing the threads, you might say, and we're going to have things going in parallel. And so it'll prevent the application from freezing up. So the first process will continue executing, and then the other code will work in the background. In Android and in all applications, the user interface thread is important not to block. So we have a task list here. You can see I've got 4 applications running on my application. We don't want them to stop. There is a literal loop, or a looper they call it, an infinite loop, a while loop, that continually checks on each task and gives each task a little bit of processing power. So it's the scheduler in the operating system. Now, if we were to stop one of those tasks and it had to sit and wait for a response, then your whole phone will freeze and it'll appear like your application is dead. You might get an application alert that says the process isn't responding. What do you want to do? Close the app? You might want to. And if the user does that, then you'll probably never come back to your app. They'll call it a buggy app, and you don't want that to happen. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use this interface thread, which is responsible to keep the user interface running. We're not going to mess that up. Instead, we're going to offload this to a background task, and we'll let that handle the retrieval of network information. And that way the looper can continue to go on, and the user can continue to choose menus and buttons and just wait for the weather to get updated in the second app. Now, to do all this network requests and all this looping and background processing, there are libraries that are built to handle these kind of things. So Android has several libraries available to us. There's one called Volley and another one called Retrofit. So Volley is the official documented library that you would find on the Android tutorials, and that's the one we're going to use. It's been around for a long time. However, there's another one called Retrofit, and it's actually probably more feature-full. It might be a little bit easier to use, and it's actually shown up recently in the process called the Jetpack. So Jetpack is a collection of libraries that are considered best practices by Google. And so even though we're not going to use Retrofit, it might be a better choice for future programming. But they work very similarly, so the concepts will be the same in either library. So here's what's ahead of us. We're going to create a weather application using an API and an Android. So we're going to install the Volley library. We're going to parse a JSON data feed, and then we're going to use asynchronous methods using callbacks to update our user interface. And so all of that stuff is just ahead of us. So let's take a look at how to build a weather app using Android. Hey, welcome to a new series of videos we're going to do for Android development. As you can see, I have an app on the screen, and I'm going to show you what it does. So if I type in the word of a city like Phoenix and choose Use City Name as my button, I should see a list of temperatures, weather reports. And so that's what we're going to make in this next few videos. So this weather app is going to demonstrate how to use REST API services. And so you can see that I've got the current temperature and the current forecast for my city. You can see the Phoenix weather is pretty boring. It's clear, 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 and some showers perhaps. And it gets pretty hot here, so we're up to, that's Celsius, that's 43 degrees. So the type of data that I'm going to get looks like here. So for instance, if I do a search for the query of the City of London, I'm going to get back a JSON report that looks like this. It's going to have an array and an object, and then you can see I have London, and then this important number here, which is the ID number for this city. So I'm going to copy that number, and we're going to use it in another API endpoint. So let's scroll down here and see what this would do. So for instance, here I'm going to choose this example for London, and you can see the number 44418 is for London. And the weather report then shows up as a series of text, really. It's JSON, and then some other things that tell us about where we got the information from. And what we're going to do is turn this into an application that runs on Android, and so you can make your own weather report app. So let's see what some of the other things that I've programmed are. So if I type in the name Phoenix again and choose Get City ID, you're going to see a pop-up that says the ID number down here. So let's go back and try what they gave us as an example here, London. So London, England, I assume, and we'll choose Get City ID, and you can see 44418 is the number. So now I'm going to choose 44418 as my entry, and the second button says Use the City ID, and now you can see that I'm going to get a report for the London weather. So that looks like it's probably correct. Light clouds, heavy clouds, showers, that's not Phoenix. And then finally, the last part where it says city name, if I change this to London, it's going to use this API twice. It's going to first of all look up the ID number, and then it will resubmit the ID number in and give us the weather report. So we're going to go from simple to more complex. You're going to see some things in this tutorial that will teach you about REST services, how to consume APIs, and how to do some callbacks, because this is like an asynchronous function. So this is a little bit more advanced programming when we've got online services involved. So I'm going to take you through step by step on how to build this application. We'll start with showing how to create the layout, and then we'll install the Volley library, which is used for getting online data like we have here. And then we're going to program each of these buttons. So the first one is simple, the second one's a little more complex, and then the third one is a double call to the service. So go simple to more complex, and by the time you're done, you'll understand how to use REST API services in your Android application. Hi, in this video, we're going to go through the process of creating the layout for the application you can see here. It's a REST API service that will turn into a weather app. So the first steps that we're going to do is create a new project. We're going to create 3 buttons, a data entry line, and then a list. And so that's just a head. So I'm going to start a new project so you can see everything straight from the very beginning. So let's go to Android Studio. I'm going to choose an empty activity project, and let's give it a name. So I'm going to name mine as Weather API App. You can see the package name is the name of where I work, which is Grand Canyon University, my name, and then Weather App. So this has to be a unique string. This is usually the format that people work with. The location you can save to any point on your hard drive, likely in your Documents folder. Make sure that you choose Java. Kotlin is the more up-to-date language, but Java still is by far the more popular. And I'm not quite sure what the minimum SDK is for Java, so I'm choosing 21, which is pretty much covering everybody out there, so 94%. And then I'm ready to click Finish. All right, you can see that the little time has passed and the project is up and running. So just to refresh your memory, we've got ourselves 2 files that are important when you start a new project. There's the activity main, I'll double click, and you can see that's the layout. And then the main activity Java file is where we do the coding. So in this video, we're going to modify the layout and we're going to create something that will look like the final product. So the first thing I need to do is just delete the text that's there. So I will select Hello World and press delete. Now I'm going to put in 3 buttons across the top. All right, so now the tricky part of getting these 3 buttons spaced out is to manage their constraints properly. So for the first button, we're going to put the constraint to the top of the screen and to the left. For the second button, we're going to have the top of the constraint match the top of the first button. And then we're going to do the same thing for the third. So now I've got I'm trying to adjust these, so I'm changing the margins to 0 so there's no extra padding. But I'm having trouble linking them left and right. So they're all lined up at the top, but I think I need to go into the text area. So instead of looking at the graphical view, I'm going to switch to the code view. So this brings up the XML. And I can manually put in the things that I need to do here. So let's see, button 1 is which guy? The first one right here. This is button. And let's make sure we got the constraints right. So the start of the button is to the start of the parent. Now the end of the button goes to button 2. That's correct. Now let's go to button 2 and let's see. So his doesn't have a beginning constraint. So I'm going to manually add that. So I'm going to type in the word start of, and you can see that it automatically provides me with a type ahead. So I want to do the first choice. The start of this button is going to match the end of the previous button. So I'll select the first one. And now it says which button do you want to select? So this first one. All right, so now the end of the button is going to be constrained to the start of the third button. That's correct. And the top should match the top of the first button. Okay, so I believe button 2 is in the right spot. Let's check the graphics. There, you can see the button 1 and button 2 are evenly spaced, and this kind of wavy line says that there's a two-way constraint going on. Now I need to add the constraints for the third button to spread him out. So let's go back to code, and I'm going to do the same. So let's see, let's check the constraints. So the end of this button goes to the end of the parent, which is the right margin. That's correct. The top of this guy matches the top of button 2. So yes, they're horizontally, they're going to be the same vertical distance down. Now I want to change the constraint to be the start of this is going to be to the end of the previous buttons. So I'm looking for start to end of. And now it says the end of who? That would be the end of button 2, which is the center button. All right, so now we have a end, start, and top. That looks good to me. Let's check the view in graphics now, and they are now all evenly spaced. So that's kind of a tricky thing, how to get these spaced across evenly. All right, so now I want to rename these. Instead of button, button 2, and button 3, I'm going to give them names that match the purpose for which I'm going to program them. So I'm going to switch to this middle button, which is called split, and you can see the XML code and the layout here on the right. So I want to modify this first button here, and his name is currently button. So I want to change his ID to btn underscore and then his purpose, which is get city ID. And you can see that all of the constraints just fell apart. That's because down here in the second button, you can see it's still thinking that button is the guy he's supposed to be attached to. So that doesn't work, obviously. So I'm going to copy and paste this ID number over top of those. And now the constraints are back to normal. Good. Okay, so now let's change the ID number for button 2. So he is going to be btn, and his job is to get the weather by city ID. So when you click this, we're going to have the ability to translate an ID number to a city weather report. So that's why we get weather by city ID. And you can see I'm going to copy this, and the reference down here needs to change. So I'll paste over top of that and paste over top the second one, and they're back. Good. All right, so what happens? This one needs to be pasted. So I'm replacing the ID numbers. Let's see, the third one is button 3, and so he is going to be btn, and we're going to say get weather by city name. So you can see the difference. This one was city ID. We're going to provide the name of the city here to get the weather report. All right, so let's copy him and replace this reference here to button 3. And I believe that is now balancing out correctly. So that was a little tricky, but we got all of our buttons in a row, and we changed their ID numbers. All right, so now we've got to give the button text something better than what we have here. So the text, is there anything in here about the text? There is not a property listed in the XML for text. So let's go back to the graphical view, and I'm going to select the first, and let's go check the property. So here is a text property. It says button. So we're going to say get city ID is his name. All right, so that changed the text property. This one here is going to be get weather by ID number. And then the last one is going to be the same. It's get weather by name. And let's see, they are not quite fitting. So let's change this, and I'll just say get gets out of the way, and we'll say weather by ID, and the other one will be weather by name. And there's just barely enough space, so that probably will work. Now, that's the buttons. Let's go to the next part, which is a text edit. So plain text is what I'm looking for. And I'm going to drag him in. And you can see why I called it edit text, because that's the default name, or the ID. Let's put the constraints in. So I want this to be attached to the left margin, and the other end to the right margin. And now I want the width to be the full width. So let's change the width to 0dp, which is also known as match constraints. So it spreads out to the full width. Now the top of this thing, let's match it to the bottom of the first button. So let's see, we want the top to the get city by ID bottom. And then it says I'm automatically going to leave you an 88 pixels margin. Let's just change that to 8, so it's pretty close. That looks pretty good. Now let's give this a name. So instead of edit text, we're going to say et underscore data input. So it's a generic data input. We're going to use it to capture names and numbers. So I'm just going to call it et data input. Now let's see, down in the bottom we're going to see a text area. So it says name. I'm going to delete that. And for hint, I'm going to say city name is a good hint. And now we've got city name listed. All right, so the last one is a list. So I need to go to the common area, and you can see that recycler view is the common most recommended thing if you want to use a list view. If you want to display a list of any items and scroll through it, recycler view is the recommended way. Now you can do that if you like. However, there's a lot of extra code and steps that are involved compared to a legacy option. So even though this is legacy, I'm choosing list view because it's so simple. Now the advantages of list view are its simplicity, but the disadvantage is if you start adding hundreds of items to a list, it will run very slowly and consume all kinds of resources on your app. Well, I know that on my list, I'm only going to have 5 items, and it's so simple to program, I'm going with list view. All right, so let's do the constraints here. So the top of this has to match to the bottom of the data input. And let's leave a little space here. Let's go 8 pixels. Let's go with the left side to match the left here. And the right side equally drag to the right. All right, so you can see the constraints are here. The start is the start of the parent, end to the end of the parent, bottom. Top is to the bottom of the data input. And I'm going to leave off the bottom constraint now because it might just fall off the edge of the screen without any trouble. All right, we give it an ID. Let's call this thing LView for list view, and I'm going to call it weather report or weather reports. And I'm going to use the plural for more than one. All right, so that gives us an idea of what's coming. Now let's just run this and see what it looks like. All right, you can see that it says Gradle is finished. My REST API changes to the new app, and it says Weather API app. So you can see that I have 3 different buttons. I have a city name, so I can type in something here. And then when we're done, we're going to be able to generate the city's weather report down in the list view below. So that's the first step. Now, this is kind of a tedious process, so I'm going to provide you with the XML file, which is this code right here. So you don't have to retype everything like I did, and that will adjust any for errors if you've got any. So on to the next video. We're going to start creating some button listeners, so that way when these buttons are clicked, they do something. So that's coming up soon. Hey, welcome to the 3rd video of our application for doing a weather report. As you can see in the previous video, we created a layout. In this video, we're going to create some button listeners so that each of these buttons are now active. So let's get started with creating some code that makes these buttons work. So I don't need to look at the XML file anymore, so I'm going to just close that. And let's get into the code here, which is main activity Java. You can find that here in the folder called Java, and then the first project folder and main activity. So the first thing we need to do is get the values of all the buttons and their ID numbers. So the first three things that I'm going to capture are the button names. So let's put in the button class, and then I'm going to assign a value for each of these buttons so we can program it. So btn underscore city ID, get weather by ID, and get weather by name. I think those are pretty close to what I named them in the layout. They don't have to be exact, but it certainly helps if they are almost exact. The other two controls on the screen are the list view and the edit text. So edit text is ET data input, and list view I'm going to call LV weather report. All right, so I've got those three categories here, and it just occurred to me that these are all in the wrong location. Notice I typed them inside of where it says uncreate. So I'm going to Control X to cut them out and move them up so that they are now class member variables, they're called. So these are accessible for all of the code that will appear in the main activity. So that makes it much more easy to program. All right, so now when the onCreate method is called, we're going to assign these things a value. So let's go one by one. All right, so let's get the first three buttons. So btn underscore city ID equals, and we're going to find its ID number. So we use the word find view by ID, and r.id gives us the resource value. So that's what R stands for, resource ID number, and then the name that I assigned it in the layout. And the other two are just the same, so we're going to use find view by ID and try to match up the values in the layout and give them a value here in the program. The same holds true for the edit text and for the list view. So we use find view by ID to capture the actual number that's assigned to these. So this is an integer that is stored into the actual button variable and the edit text variable and the list view variable. So it's a good idea to comment your code just in case there's somebody looking at it that doesn't understand it as well as you do. So I'll just say this is assigning values to each control in the layout. This is pretty standard ideas, so hopefully you've seen this before, but if it's your first app, maybe not the best choice for your first app, but I'll help you along the best we can. All right, let's move on to the next part where we're going to actually now create some listeners. So the next section is going to be click listeners for each button. So that way when we click them, we know we have something going on. So the next section, we are going to create the set on click listener for the button. And you can see there's type ahead code that makes this much easier. So we'll have a new on-click listener that comes out of this. This is what they call an anonymous function where it doesn't have a name, it just has the inline definition. And inside of this code, we can create events now if the button is clicked. So the best way to test a control is sometimes just to put in a toast. Let's test this one out to say you clicked me. Now I'm going to check the rest of these the same way. So for each of these buttons, I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to add the method called onClickListener or setOnClickListener. And then inside of the parentheses, we'll create a new listener event. And for each of these, I'm going to create a toast message, so that way it tells me that I've been clicked. And you can see that I'm going to now modify the actual text so we can distinguish between each of these items. So I'm going to run the app again, so I'll click this little circle arrow. It'll restart the app, and then we'll test out each button. So let's test this out. If I click the first button, nothing happened. If I click the second button, it says you clicked me too. That seems to be working, and third seems to be working. So this is why you test out your code as you run. Something went wrong with button 1. What was the matter with it? Something didn't happen correctly. Let's just double check everything and make sure we got the name. So the button name is called Get Weather by ID. And that is also down here. So that is the incorrect name. So let's try that again. btn, let's do by city ID, and let's save that. I think that might be better because we had two click listeners for the same button, and obviously the second one wins, the first one was ignored. Let's try that again. All right, so we're up and running. Let's go and choose Get by ID. And what happens now? So now we have a you clicked me 1, you clicked me 2, hopefully comes up, and 3. We got all of them. Now let's do one more thing. I'm going to put in the city name here, and then we're going to echo out the name of the city as we try each of these buttons. So let's go and grab the value from the weather by name. Let's see, this would be a good one. The third button, we're going to add in some new code. So instead of you clicked me 3, I'm going to put in this. You typed, and then I'm going to put in the value that comes from the edit text. So let's do et input data dot get text, and then I'm going to use a toString method. So that should get the text that was entered into the edit text and then redisplays it on the toast. Let's see what that does. Okay, so we're up and running now. Let's put in the word Kansas City, how about? And let's then, if I can type correctly, and let's try the third one that says get by name. And it says you typed Kansas City. So that seems to be working. So we've got ourselves button listeners, we have the value of text that comes from the data input, and now we're going to actually go and do some coding that will get the values from the weather report service. Hi, and welcome to the 4th video of our series on using API services with Android Studio. We're going to translate the text that's over here on the left side and put it into the app that's over here on the right side. So in order to actually produce something that's sensible from the data on the left side, we're going to have to get some tutorial information on how to use a library called Volley. So to help us through this process of using Volley, I'm going to the actual developer documentation from Google. So developers.android.com, and training Volley, that's what we're looking at. So the section that we're in right now is called Transmitting Data Over the Network Using Volley. There's actually something previous to this, if you're interested, how to handle general network traffic. So this is kind of the overview of the old way, or the pre-Volley way that was done things. And this will work if you want to go through this process. However, Google is recommending that we use a library called Volley, and it's right in their official documentation. So let's go see what it says about what we're going to do. So Volley, what is Volley? Volley is an HTTP library. Okay, translate. What that means is we can take a library, extra software, install it into our project. It will handle HTTP traffic, or let's say it will be able to handle text that comes in this format, this JSON text. And then it will translate it into something that we can use in the app. So they use the word easier and faster. Easier and faster than what? It's easier and faster than the previous section called network operations. And it says Volley is available on GitHub. Well, we don't actually have to go to GitHub to get it. We can use it right in our dependency manager. So come down to this section that says implementation, and it says we're going to copy version 1.1.1. Nice number there. Now we're going to put that somewhere. Let's go back into our Android Studio. So to put in any dependencies, we go down to the section called Gradle scripts. So what is Gradle? Gradle is a dependency manager, and we want the second option. Double click here. So a dependency manager takes a look at the code that you see at the bottom of the screen. You can see I just pasted in the new Volley library. Everything that is in this list called dependencies is automatically downloaded from their source, which is probably GitHub, and it copies all the files to your project that you need, and then those libraries magically are usable in your code. So there's a lot of work done behind the scenes. You don't have to download and install files. The dependency manager does that for you. So it's going to say, go to this website, find Volley version 1.1.1. Now there might be newer versions out there, but Google documentations are using this, so let's choose that. As soon as you add anything to the dependencies list, you'll get a message at the top of the screen that says, Gradle files have changed since the last project sync. A project sync may be necessary. Well, maybe is kind of a strange word. It will be necessary. So let's go ahead and click the button that says Sync Now. Now at the bottom you will see a message that says your status is finished. So something was just installed on our program. All right, so everything looks green, there's no problems, so let's move back to our documentation. So it says, now we've done this, You can also, okay, we're not going to have to do that. Okay, we have some lessons in here. How to create a simple request, a request queue, a standard request, and a custom request. All right, so looks like we'll start at the simple, and then we'll build up from there. So the process that you're going to see in the next few videos is we're going to create things a simple way, and then refactor it to be a little bit better for more scalable programs. So some of our code is going to start to look like spaghetti code, and then we're going to separate it into its appropriate classes. And when we're done, we'll have a pretty decent looking app that is modular, and that way all the pieces are kind of in their own place. Let's start with the first one that says send a simple request. Let's try that. So a simple request means we're going to go and get a weather report. So here is some code that we're going to work with. Now, we're going to modify most of this, but we will have a pretty good idea of how this works by the time the video is over. So before we get to that, it says you need to add the internet permission to your app's manifest. So Android permission internet. Let's go check that out. So I'm back into my project, and the manifests are up here in the folder called manifest. Let's go and open that XML file. So we're ready to add the permission into our manifest file. So right up here before the word application, I'm going to start typing. I'm going to use an open bracket, so like the less than sign. And immediately the type aheads helps telling me there's things that you can put here. What are you looking for? And what I'm looking for is the first one that says uses permission. And isn't that nice? It provides me some type ahead code that says, what do you want to make this application access? Well, internet is the key because we are going to be looking at data that's online. So let's close the tag. And we could use the tag closing as it's here, or I could just put in a slash, and that's a self-closing tag. So either one of those is acceptable. So now we will automatically get permissions. This doesn't require the user to click anything, so there's no special code to see if they've approved or denied the permissions. So internet permissions is pretty standard, so there's just one line of code. Okay, so now we've got ourselves the permissions. Now we're going to come down to the request queue, and let's see what all this is going to do. So we need to have what they're going to ask to fill in a text view. We don't have a text view, we're just going to use a toast, but it's almost the same. Now I'm going to copy all of this right down to the last line. So I'm leaving out text view, and I'm going to copy and bring this right into my project. And where am I going to put it? Well, I'm going to put it in the first button. So the button here has got the first click listener, and I'm just going to paste everything inside there. All right, so a whole bunch of stuff just turned red line. We're going to have to add some new libraries, it looks like. So when we click the button, the first thing that happens is we are going to initiate something called a request queue. A request to what? A request to the service online. And so the queue means that you can't like have simultaneous requests. They have to get in line. They have to take turns. So the request queue is this object that's going to be like a lineup. So it says here if you want to import the class, we'll do that. So we just imported it. There should be something new under the imports. So do we have a request queue? Yeah, line 12 says we just imported this from the Volley library. So remember, we have Volley as one of our dependencies. If we didn't put in the dependency down here in Gradle, then this exercise would have not worked right now. So we've got ourselves the first line fixed. Now the next item says we're going to use an object called Volley, and it also needs to be imported. So let's see if I can press Alt-Enter. And it says we've got a new request. Now what's going on here? It says the context. Context says this doesn't work. So what's the matter with it? It says your context is supposed to be of the main activity context. Okay, so context is real confusing. If you want to see a previous video on context, look in the playlist here. I've created some Android tutorials on understanding context. Anyway, the context tells you where is this thing in the program. So I'm going to type in the word main activity, which is this class file, and then .this. So that is the context of where this is being called from. It's being called from main activity. All right, so what's the string? Well, it's not from google.com. Let's delete that. And let's go get a string from somewhere else. So I'm going to go back into my browser, and I want to get this string from one of these API services. So let's go find out what that would be up here. So I want a string that looked like this here, the one that says query equals London. And so I want to get the ID number of the city. So this is the one that's going to work. So I'm going to copy this whole URL. So let's do right click and copy. And we're going to trim off the last part that says London, but we'll use most of it. So let's go back into our code here, and for it says string URL, we're going to keep it as London for now, just to make it simple. So this will only work for the city of London. All right, so now we've got ourselves a request and a URL. So the first thing it says is we're going to get a string request. Now there are different types of requests that we can use. String request is the one that we will probably not use. What we're going to ask for is called a JSON object request or a JSON array request, because as you look at this data, this is clearly JSON formatted data, which is Java object notation. And so we're going to skip this string thing in just a minute. But for right now, let's keep with the code as they've given it to us. So string request, let's do Alt-Enter, and we'll import the class. Okay, so we also have to do this other Alt-Enter. Keep importing these things. Okay, got it? All right, so here's the part that says text view. Let's get that out of the way. And the response of the substring. So let's take, we know that the response is coming back, and it's going to provide the first 500 characters. Well, I'm going to just delete all that and the comments. So what I want to do is just display the whole thing. So I'm going to put it into a toast. So I'm going to use toast again, and let's go to the text here and say, instead of the string, I'm just going to put in the word response. So what comes back from the response will be texted out in a toast. All right, so now we have an error listener. So let's go and import these. It looks like we have to do more Alt-Enter, import the class, and instead of using the text view, I'm going to put in a toast, and I'm going to say something like a problem occurred, or error. All right, so then we get to the end. So this request object is all bundled up from line 49 to 60. And then once we're done, it doesn't actually occur until we add it to this queue. So what's the queue? And where did we assign that? So the queue was assigned up here, a request queue, and then we added the request to the queue. So that means we could add more than one request, and it will take them in sequential order. And then we're done, we're going to have another text. So let's just comment that out. I don't want to see that. All I care to see is what was given back from our London query. Okay, let's cross our fingers and run the app again. All right, the app's up and running. And so it doesn't matter what we type in here. Remember, we're hard coding the word London in here. So let's choose get city ID. And look at there. Let's hide that keyboard and try it again. Here's our response. It says title London. Let's look at that again. All of that is the same thing that came through from our code here. So it says title London, location type city. Let's run it again. Compare the two side by side. You can see that they are the same thing. So this is formatted nicely, and this is just a straight old text. But the concept is there. Now we're going to change some of the code here, and we're going to make this into a JSON object. So you can see that there are two different types of brackets here. This is the curly bracket. This is a JSON object. And this is the square bracket, which means this is a JSON array. So what we want to do is get a JSON array object, just because that's the type of data that's printed on the screen. If we were to look at a different one of these requests, such as one of these down below here, let's get London, and let's look at the data. You can see that the first character in the JSON is a curly bracket. So this would be a JSON object that we're trying to collect. And then inside that JSON object, you can see that there is a new array. And that array contains like 6 or 7 different days of weather. So two different types of JSON data that we're looking at here, either a JSON object or a JSON array. So let's go back to where we were, which was this London query. And we are going to be looking for a JSON array object. So let's go back into the code and modify a little bit. All right, so I'm going to probably delete all of this here. And let's comment it out first of all. So put in a control / to put a comment from everybody. All right, I'm going to type in a capital J. Now look what we have for options. What I want are one of these two right here. So JSON object requests, that's if you were expecting to get a JSON object. In this case, though, we're expecting a JSON array. So I'm going to choose JSON array request. I'm going to call it request. And just like I had before, I'm going to use the same model. So you can see that the text here is a good pattern to follow. So we're going to have a new, and this time I'm going to have JSON array request. What are the things that we're going to fill in for the parameters? So the first parameter we need is request.method.get. So let's just type in there request.method, let's see, capital M, and then get. So that's the type of request. So in APIs, you can have gets, posts, deletes, puts, and updates. Those are all things that are different types. So get and post are obviously the most common ones if you've seen those in any kind of programming before. Okay, so the next item is the URL. So the URL is the string that's above us. So I'm going to just retype URL. And now the next part is the response. So I'm going to type in a new, and then the word response. And I'm looking for a response listener. So I'm going to type in response listener. And what kind of item am I supposed to put between these brackets? You can see before it was expecting a string. Well, I'm expecting now a JSON array. So let's type in JSON array. All right, so you can see that we now have a semicolon at the end. And I'm supposed to have more code to help me out here. So let's go down to this helpful hint that says implement methods. So listener is going to have two items. It's supposed to be a response with a success and also down here a error. So let's see if that'll generate that for us. I'm going to choose implement methods, and sure enough, there is a response. So let's click OK. All right, so the first one was created for us. Okay, so it generated the first results okay, but I think what we need is another result, which is on failure. So let's put in a comma right before the end, and let's put in the word new response, and I want to do a response error listener. There we go. And the error listener needs to have its methods. Man, I wish this would give me some more type ahead automatically, but I'm going to go through the steps one at a time. All right, so I've got myself what looks a lot like the previous code that we coded, but we've got an error. So let's hover and see what the problem is. Okay, it says here in your JSON request, it says, I cannot resolve the constructor. So the constructor is obviously missing a parameter. That's what a constructor does. It takes all the parameters and creates an object. So I've got get, URL, and the request listener. So something's different than what it's expecting. I'm not sure what it is. So let's go look at the documentation and find out. So I'm going to switch back into my code. Now I did a simple request, and let's take a look here at what's called the standard request. So a standard request, instead of using a string request like we did before, we're going to use a JSON object. And let's scroll down here. It says, here's what you need to do. Your JSON, this one's called an object request. We did the array request, almost the same. And look at the parameters here. So the first parameter is get. That's what we have. URL. Then there's something called null. Actually, I don't remember what null is for. And then the rest of it is what kind of a thing that you're actually trying to request. So null is probably some kind of a parameter that maybe if I read the instructions more closely, it would tell me. But I don't see it in here. But I'm going to take their word for it and put the word null in. Okay, so let's go look here and put in null. And now it looks good. So the parameter was called JSON requests, null. I'd have to go look at more details to know what that was. Anyway, the problem seems to have disappeared. Now we can go to the response and add something now. So let's put in a toast. So I put in a toast, create a new one, and what I'm interested in is to know what comes back from the response. So let's take the word response then, and instead of the text here, let's paste it. It doesn't like that, so the response is not a string. It's something called a Json array. So we can just turn it into a string with a toString method, and that's good. Okay, for the next item, the error listener, let's put in a toast again, and let's put in a message that says something wrong. All right, so we've changed our data from a string request to a JSON array request. And let's hopefully make this work. Okay, down at the bottom, this turned red. I'm just going to cut that out and move it up to the top here. So why doesn't it like string requests? Our request was called something else. It's called here. It's request. So let's just copy this and put it over top. Okay, all errors gone. Let's see what happens. Okay, so the app's going to run here, and before it gets started, I'm going to switch over to the data that we are expecting, this screen here, and let's put in get city ID. There it is. So that was the same text that we have listed here, and you can see, if you look carefully, it starts with a little square bracket. So we've got ourselves the get city ID. So we can do better than just getting the entire JSON array. I mean, the string did that. The advantage of using JSON data is that you can split it up into pieces. So what I want to do first is get the entire array and then get one piece of that array. So let's go with this. So I want to get the first item in the array. So this is a JSON object, and we're going to call it city info. And it's going to be from the response. So the response is going to be the get JSON object, and you can see that it's expecting an index. So the first item in the list. So the first item in the list is obviously it's an array of one item. So item 0 is the first item. Now we got an error. It says you have an exception that needs to be handled because you're not guaranteed to actually get valid data. So let's surround it with a try catch. Okay, so we're going to try and do this, and if something goes wrong, we'll print the error. All right, so now when we're done, we should be able to get the actual JSON object. Well, I'm not interested in the JSON object. Let's look at it again. The information that I'm looking at is this is the key that I'm looking in. This is the target. So WOEID. So I got the object, which is this item. Now I need the key value, which is WOEID. So let's copy him, and we'll bring him to the fore. So let's go to the next line. So we got the JSON object. Now I want a string, and I'm going to call this thing the city ID. And so we're going to do the city info dot get string, and now I'm going to paste in the name of the string. Isn't that cool? So if that string exists, this try catch will succeed, and we will have a new string called city ID. So that's the target that we're looking for on this function. So we're going to call it city ID equals, and then I'm going to type in city ID. Oops, let's try that again. City ID. Okay, so now it won't let me use city ID in two places. All right, so you're getting to see all the errors that are coding as they occur. So it says I can't figure out what city ID is. That's because we declared city ID inside the try catch, and as soon as we left try catch, the scope of that variable is now gone. So what I have to do is define city ID further out. So let's go and put it right above the try, and let's say by default it's an empty string, and I don't need to redeclare it. And then down here it works. Okay, so we're going to have city ID is defined, then it's redefined as whatever comes from the value, and then we'll print it here. All right, let's see if that works. We've gone a long ways. We're going to run this. I'm going to bring up the web page so we can see the ID that we're expecting, and then finally what happens here. So I click here. The city ID is 44418. Beautiful. All right, does that work for all cities? Let's go and check. So instead of London, Let's change the URL now. So let's put in a new city. So I'm going to put in Phoenix and save it, relaunch the app, and away we go. Let's come over to here, and instead of London, I'm going to type in Phoenix. So the ID number is now this one, 247-1390. Let's see if we get the same results over here. So I'm going to choose Get ID, and there it is, 247-1390. Okay, so it seems to be getting the ID number correctly. Now, I would like to be able to put in the city name here and then get the ID. So that's the final step that we're trying to get to. This has been a long video, but I'm showing you all the steps that go into trying to figure out the code and the documentation. So the query, let's just take off the city name. And now in the URL, we're going to add to it a new value. So let's go with plus, and let's get the value from the data input field, get text, and then I'm going to change that to a toString method. So now we should see whatever value here is attached to the query. One more run. Data that we're expecting, and then the app shows up here. So now if I type in the word Phoenix, and let's get rid of the keyboard, choose Get City ID, we see 247-1390. Let's try somebody else. Let's try Miami. Everyone wants to know what the weather in Miami is, so let's check that out. There's the ID is 245-022. Let's go and see what Miami brings up on our app. Miami, I assume that's Florida. And what do we get? We got an ID number. They seem to be working. So test this out with various cities. Now, the reason why we did this one first is because we're going to then get the weather report by that city ID. And so that'll be the next phase of our video here. So this is a great stopping point. We've got ourselves one item from our list, and that is an important ID number. Hi, welcome to another video in our weather app. In this video, we're going to do some refactoring. So in this current state, we have a lot of code inside a button. It's kind of complex, and we're going to have to make more buttons, and so the code will get longer. So we're going to try to do some refactoring to make this actually a little bit more well designed. So I'm going to go to the documentation that we were looking at here. So this was Google's page. We skipped over a section called request queue. We're going to go back to that. Down here it says use a singleton pattern. So the singleton pattern is common to lots of things in not just Java, but all applications. And a singleton is a class that can only be instantiated a single time, one time. So the name, singleton. And all singletons are pretty much coded the same way. If you haven't seen one, this is a great introduction to why they're important. So first of all, what do we care about for singleton? And why do we only need one instance? Let's go look at our code here and figure out where this would be. So the line that's important to us in this singleton lesson is on line 50. So we're creating a queue called a request queue. And then at the end of the code here, we are adding a new request. So if you were to click the button multiple times, it would multiply put in requests. And each request, as you can see, takes a few seconds. Now we don't want to have multiple queues running in our program. One queue is good. We just can only handle so much network traffic. And so the idea of a singleton says we're going to make a single class that will be listening for button clicks anywhere in our application, and it'll handle them in the order that they're given. So that's where we're going with this refactoring. All right, so we're going to take their code that they've given us here and copy and paste it, and then modify it a little bit to match our program. There's a few things here that we don't need, but we will delete them. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a class called mySingleton. But before we do that, I'm just going to copy here, and that copies the entire gray box. And then we're going to make a new class called mySingleton. So let's go back into the project here, right-click in the Java area, and we'll call it mySingleton. Now we're going to rename that later to something like data service singleton or the request singleton. Okay, so we got ourselves the code. I'm going to overwrite it, so I'm going to delete that and paste. And we've got ourselves all of the code here. So request queue is the important part. We're going to have to import some things here. So let's do import the class. Let's see, I'll try Alt-Enter. Image loader. Now, we're not going to use the image loader, so I'm going to get rid of him. Context is important, so we'll do Alt-Enter again. All right, so the next section down here is called image loader, so I'm going to just come down to this line here where it's got image loader. Don't delete this curly. Let's just delete the image loader part. And let's see, a couple more lines will be gone. Now we have a constructor, it looks like. So the constructor is important because it sets up the ability for only one of these classes to exist. So it'll take a parameter called context, and then the request queue is the important part. It says when you're going to create this singleton, it's going to create one version of the request queue. Okay, then the next part is the singleton classic setup. So all languages would probably use singletons this way. There's a variable called instance. The instance is, does this thing exist already? Has there been a version of this program or this module? Is it in the memory? And this is a check to see. If the instance is null, it means it hasn't been instantiated yet. Then we're going to make a new instance. And if it is already existing, then we will just return the one that's already there. So this is the key part. This is what a singleton does. It only allows one instance of the class to be instantiated, created. All right, so now let's go look at the rest of it. So the get request queue is important. It says if the request queue doesn't exist, then we're going to invent it, or we're going to make it come into being. So let's use Volley again. Do an import. And then down here, the request looks like that needs to be imported. And then image loader we're going to take out. So whatever the image loader was for, we don't care. Now we've got ourselves an entire singleton. And there's no errors. Okay, so this is the way to handle the queue. Let's go back into here. And so I'm going to comment out the existing queue, and we're going to create a new one. Let's go look at the documentation to see how to do that. Okay, so we're back to this page here that shows us how to do this code. And now it says here, if you're going to make a request queue, we can do it two ways. We can get the queue, or we can simply add the queue right now. So let's just use this line. This one's simpler. So I'm going to copy, and let's go back to our code. So I don't want to instantiate it up here. Instead, I'm going to come down here and delete the line that was there. And let's put in, instead of string requests, what was the name of the request? It's called right up here. It's just called request. So request. All right, so the problem here is what kind of a context are we supposed to send? So we need to put in the word main activity dot this. So this is where it's being run. All right, so we've got ourselves pretty much the same kind of code. I'm going to delete the original. Not a lot of changes in main activity, but the singleton gives us the ability to manage this through central locations. So let's see, delete all the stuff that we had before. Clean it up a bit. And hopefully I haven't wrecked anything. I've just done some refactoring to use what the documentation is recommending. So let's run the app. So let's see, I'll bring up the weather, Miami, and let's make sure that this is still working. So we'll get the same code here if I type in Miami, and then the button, and look at there, it worked. By the way, what happens if you don't put in something? So if I put in a city that doesn't exist, does it do anything? And it says city ID is blank, so it just gets nothing. All right, so it doesn't crash, but I don't get any value either. So that was a refactoring lesson. So we did this singleton request, and now if we were to have multiple things happening at the same time, the singleton will handle them in sequential order. Hey, welcome to part 5 of our video on Weather API app. So we're going to turn this code that you see here into a more componentized or modularized type of refactoring. So instead of having a button that has a lot of code inside of it, we're going to have a button with a little bit of code and then an external class with some helper code to go with it. So we're refactoring here to make our design better. Okay, so let's get started on this refactoring part. And we're going to create a separate class that will handle all of the items that are currently listed in the highlighted section. So what I want to do is make a class and put it in the Java class area. So I think a good name for this service is Weather Data Service. It's sort of a database access object, but it's really for online. So the first thing I want to do is define the types of methods that this class will provide. So the first one here is going to be return a string called city ID. So we are going to get the city name and then go through the API process and return a string which will be the city's ID. So all the code that we did in the previous videos will be reproduced here or copied and pasted here and then refactored. We've also got two other things that are in the future, so I'm going to put them in now even though they're not quite defined properly. So the list that we're going to get for the weather report is going to be a list of type weather report model. So a model is a class that's going to contain things like the city name, the high temperature, the low temperature, the forecast, description, and other items that we'll find in our data service. And so we're going to have two options for this. We can provide an ID for the city and then get the weather report. And then I'm going to refactor that one to have a simpler method called get the city forecast using the name or by name. And so it'll translate a name of a city directly into a forecast. And so that's what's ahead of us. Now, as you can see, the last two methods here don't have some things defined that we need to define. So I'm going to simply comment these out for now and just leave that as things that we're going to have to do in the future. So we're going to encounter some problems, but we are going to get this one here called city ID working. So we're going to return a value, hopefully, with a string. Now the return part is going to be tricky because this is not going to work like I expect, but I'm going to show you the process of learning so that way you can figure out some of the required workarounds that are ahead of us. So the first thing I'm going to do is attempt to copy and paste all of the code that's inside of the button click, and then we're going to reproduce it inside of the other class. So let's see, I got to get this highlighted correctly. I'm going to cut this out, and then we're going to replace it in the weather service. So let's go ahead and paste everything here. As soon as I paste, it says, wow, you've got a lot of things that you're working on for dependencies. Let's click OK and import all those classes. Let's start at the very first line. So we've got this string URL, and then it depends on a text item. And so we don't have a reference to the edit text item. So we're going to, first of all, delete this and change it to a parameter. So we're going to call this thing city name. And so you can see that city name is being passed in as a parameter. So that's good. So let's just see what we would do if we were to use this right now. So the goal here is to get the city ID number. And it's going to come from our new class called Weather Data Service dot get city ID, and then we're going to provide the string, which is from our edit text data input get text to string. So this here has got some issues. We've got a problem here that says get city ID doesn't work. So really, rather than just talk about the class itself, I need to make an instance of it. So let's copy and paste that, and we'll call it a lower case thing, and we're going to have a new weather data service. And then for here, we put in the lowercase, and everything's good. So the instance is created, and now we can get to the methods. So far, this makes sense. It's not going to work yet. There's still problems ahead, but this is the goal that I would like to do as a normal Java class. So let's start with this first line here. We've got a string here that's encoded. right into our into our method. So I'm going to make this an extraction. So let's see if we can refactor extract into a constant. So here's a trick that you can do, and it puts this constant name in there. That's kind of a long name. Let's just call it query for city ID. I like that. And let's press enter. Okay, so now you can see the new constant declaration is here. So it's a public static final string, and then it just copies that string up there. So it's just replacing one string with another. So the constant is got capital letters by convention, and then if we have to use that again, we don't have to use a second copy of the actual string. So it's a good idea to have one source of truth. All right, now let's keep going down. So we're going to do a new request. We're going to do a response query, and then we come down to a problem here. So we've got an issue. This was the context of main activity. Well, we don't have main activity anymore. This is no longer accessible. So what we want to do is have a value of the context here is part of our class values. So let's come up here and put in something called context, and I'll make a lowercase context instance. Let's import the class. Now how am I going to assign that? That's going to come in the form of a constructor. So let's make generate a constructor here. So let's go to generate a constructor, and you can see it says you've got a member variable called context, and let's make that a parameter that we pass in, and then we'll assign it here. So this constructor is going to modify something back in main activity. So what did we do in main activity? We created a weather data service, and you can see now it says you're missing a parameter. Well, we can get that main activity.this as the context. So we're sending our context of main activity back to here. All right, so since we now have a member variable, we'll just put in the word context down here. All right, so does this all work? Let's see, not quite. We've got another issue. Let's change this to context as well. And finally, the last one. All right, so now we've got everything fixed up here, but we've got one error at the end. What's it say here? It says you've created a return type of string, and there's no return here. So we want to return the city ID. So this is where we're going to have problems. So if I type in city ID, we are going to have issues, and it's not just the fact that it's out of scope. This literally will not work, and we're going to have to create what's called a callback. But we'll get to that. We'll demonstrate first that it doesn't work. So what's the matter here? City ID, where was it defined? It was defined up here inside of this response. So I would like to change this as well. So I'm going to move this to a higher scope. I'm going to copy this, and let's just put it up here as a member variable. And then down in here, we're going to take out the string definition. So now the scope says we have a city ID here, it's referenced here, and then hopefully returned here. So it's not going to return it, but we should be able to at least get the same kind of a toast message that we did before. Okay, so back to here. Notice how short then our code is. So our string is going to come back from the data service, and let's try a toast to see if it actually works. So I'm going to say returned an ID of, and then we're going to have the city ID. So hopefully we're going to get the response from the weather data service and then redisplay it here. So there's going to be two toasts. This toast here is the second one. Inside here was the first. So when we first get the city ID from the API, it'll toast it here, or something wrong. One of those two will happen. And then finally, we'll get here. Now, I believe that this is going to come out as empty. It won't work, and then we'll have to solve that problem. But let's test it. We're going to run here, and let's go get ourselves to the data that we're expecting. Let's try Miami again and run the app. Okay, so here we are. Let's type Miami and hide the keyboard. So the first toast will come from inside the program. So the city ID equals that. And we got a quick message there that said returned a null. Did you see that? I'm going to show it again. It says null, but then city ID equals a number. So one of the toasts has got the ID, the other one does not. Let's go check it out. Where was that? So the one that said returned an ID of null was here. So I'm going to put in here, this didn't return anything. Why not? That's kind of unfortunate. I told it to return something, but it didn't. However, inside of the weather data service, it actually showed me a city ID. So I'm going to say this worked, but it didn't return. Okay, so the comments here show me that this part works, and it didn't return it to the main activity. Okay, so how are we going to solve this problem? So we have just introduced ourselves to an asynchronous issue. What is happening is that the first toast shows that there's a null value getting returned. It like immediately skipped down to return ID, and all of this process was kind of like left in the dirt. It was left in the dust. It skipped over it. That's because we are running a background process. The Volley library automatically puts in a queue, kind of a background request, because it takes a little while for an API to return some data. A couple of seconds, that's all it takes. But we're not going to wait around and freeze up the app and make the user wait. We don't want to make things run on what's called the UI thread, which is the user interface thread. So we put this process in the background, and we just kind of let it go, and it takes its time because we know it's slow. The unfortunate result is that the city ID doesn't get assigned anything while this is in the process. So by the time we get to this line, you know, we've skipped over and we never came back to wait for it. So the solution here, one of the solutions that we can use, it's called a callback. So let's see if we can get a callback to work correctly. Callback is a way to notify the program that when this process is finished, run another method. So you can take your time, but when you're finished, I will be here waiting. So that's what a callback is. Now, in most languages, there's some things that have gone beyond callbacks. So callbacks get messy. They start to get nested brackets until you get 2, 3, 4 levels deep, and you lose track of your parentheses. And so that's called callback hell if you get too deep. And so unfortunately, developing apps in Android and Java with callbacks is still working in that method. Other languages, such as JavaScript and C# and things like that, have async and await for a newer way to manage things. So there's probably ways to do async and await with libraries in Java, but I'm just going to show you the callback method because it's built right into the language. So let's go look in some Google queries about how to do this. So I'm looking for the phrase Android callback with Volley. Now you'd expect the first thing to come up would be a documentation from Google's developer tutorials, and I scroll through here and I'm not seeing it. So there is something in here, but this is not about Volley. I looked at that one. So I'm going to just go with my Stack Overflow friends here and see what this does. Now I already checked in here and I know that there is a good explanation for how we're trying to handle this. So I'm coming down to the first answer here. It says there are 3 answers for this guy's problem. And this is a good code to follow. So it works. I've tested it out. So here's the guy's issue. He is using a JSON object request, very similar to ours. We're using a JSON array request, but the principle applies. And what he did then is he first of all defined a Volley response listener. So this here is some code that we're just going to copy it, and we're going to paste it right into our example, and then make a little tweak here that like he did. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do up here is before my actual event, I'm going to put in this interface, a Volley response listener. So you can see that the goal here for this response listener is to have two different methods. One's called onError, and it's going to have a string message. And the other one is an object response. So what kind of response are we expecting out of this thing? So out of our response here, we are pretty much getting the city ID. The city ID in this case is a string. So for my return type here, I'm going to change this to a string, and I'm going to call it actually city ID, just so I know what I'm expecting to come back. So the Volley response listener is specific to this method for right now. So now I'm going to insert this response listener into my parameters here. So let's look at the calling definition here. So I'm expecting one parameter, but I'm going to add a second one. All right, so this one here I'm going to put in as a Volley response listener. So remember, Volley is the library we're working with, and then when we get back to main activity, we can implement these two methods called onError and onResponse. Now, before we get to the response, we need to actually make it happen. So come down into my code to where the comment said this worked. This is where we know that the city ID has a valid number in it. So we are going to use the Volley response listener, and we have two choices. We have onResponse and onError. See, that's the first two items here. Those are the exact same names as were defined up in this interface. So we're going to choose onResponse and then provide the city ID as the value that's coming back to the main activity. Now let's also put in the error. So we're going to do the same process here. We're going to put in a Volley response listener dot, and this time onError. And we'll say something wrong. That's what's going to come back. Instead of a city ID, it's going to return something wrong. Okay, so this is the key to link the correct values to our main activity. As a matter of fact, since this was useless, this return, I'm going to comment it out, and I'm going to change the return type from string to void. It doesn't seem to work, doesn't work actually, so we don't even need it. But this response listener is going to help us. So back to main activity, we got to add a new item. See, we got a red line. It says your weather data service get ID has now two parameters. The second parameter is a new, we're going to call it new, Volley response listener. Now look at there. So you can see it's giving some type ahead help. I'm going to press enter. And beautiful, it now implements two different methods for us, onError and onResponse. So we are going to take the toast message and cut that out and put it inside of our response. And instead, let's see, city ID is coming out here, city ID. And then we're going to put another message in here and just say text is that something's wrong. Something wrong. Okay, and put a comma. And what do we got? We got an error still. All right, so the error says you have expected the weather data service to return a string. Oh, okay. I'm going to delete that part. We didn't actually implement that anymore. Okay, so now careful. Let's make sure we got everything right here. The get city ID method is going to have this link called the response listener, which gives us an error message or a response message, and one of those two should come out. So that is a callback. Let's see if a callback actually works. So I want to remove the toast from inside of the data service. So nothing more from there. That's just getting the data. And the toasts now that exist are here and here. Okay, let's run this. Okay, let's switch back into the weather ID and get the app up and running. And let's see if we can get a valid ID to text out in front of us. So let's go to Miami again and remove the keyboard and choose Get City ID. Okay, it says it returned a value. It seems to be working. Let's try London, and let's minimize the keyboard and choose Get the ID. Looks like we got 44418. So the process of doing a callback is a little complex. It's a little awkward, but it works. So we have now successfully created a weather data service, and it has the method called getCityID, and we found out that if we actually want to get that value, we can't just return it as a string. We have to wait for it, so we use a callback method. All right, one final refactoring is this here is going to be used in the other buttons, so there's no sense in creating a new one each time I click a button, so I'm going to cut this and move it up. And so it now sits at the class level. And now what's the problem here? It says it must be declared as final. Let's just put it as final there. And so now it should be working. Okay, so the next video we're going to do is we're going to take this nice pattern that we've developed here and apply it to the other two buttons. And so that's just ahead. Hi, welcome back to another video in our weather app. We're using an API service, as you can see on the left side, and we're trying to get the API to display a weather report over on the right side. So we're going to create this button here called Give Me a Weather Report by ID. That'll be coming right up. So in the previous videos, we were able to get just the ID of the London city as 44418. Now we want to take this 44418 and put it into our input field, and then choose this button called Get Weather by ID, and that will produce a weather report. And then in a future video, we're going to take the word London and then go for Get Weather by Name. But in the intermediate, we're going to just be happy if we can get it by the ID number. So that's what's coming next. All right, so let's go and take a look at the code and see where we're going to go with that. So this here right now is the button click listener, and all it does is tell me a toast that says you clicked me too. So we want to get rid of that and change it to some real code. Now we're going to use this weather service ID. So let's copy and paste all of this code here and hopefully just not have to do a whole lot of changes to it. So I'm going to copy him and paste him down here. So we obviously don't want to do get city ID. We want to get weather by ID. I think that is the method that's coming up. So let's double check here. We commented it out. And let's see, this was called get forecast by ID. I'm sorry, let's comment this back in. And I'm going to use get forecast by ID as my next item. All right. And then there's a bunch of junk that's not working yet because this obviously has not been coded. Let's come back and fix these errors, but first of all we have to make sure that our weather service is working. So what is the first error? It says I promised it that we would be using a list of weather report model. Well, that's true, but we don't have one of these called a weather report model yet. So let's cut this out and put it into here and call this report. And we're going to make it a new list. And let's see, we can't use list, it's going to be array lists. There. And we have to import array lists. Okay. Now here's the issue with weather report model. The weather report model is supposed to be a class that saves a whole bunch of data fields. And we haven't defined it yet. So let's create it. And it's going to be in this package right here, and click OK. There it is. So we have a weather report model. Now, what kind of properties does it need? Well, to answer that question, we have to go look at the data that's been provided to us. So I'm going to go back to my API, and let's back up a few. until we get down to one of these. So we're going to do a forecast. So the forecast is going to look like this. It's going to have all these properties in it. So I could probably just copy one of these and start using my weather model based on the names here. So let's just copy that and let's paste it here. And I'm going to use that as a starting point. So using the list of properties that I got from the API, I am going to create all the properties that will go into this object called the weather report model. So each one of them has its own data property. So you can see that the int for ID matches the type that's listed in the strings above. So it's an int. Now most of these are strings. So the weather state name, the weather state abbreviation, and the wind direction, compass, the created date, all of these are strings. Now some of these are decimals. So I'm going to use the word float as the property for the number. And so we got floats for the max temperature, the temp, the min temperature, the wind speed, the wind direction. The air pressure doesn't have a decimal point, so it looks like that's an integer. Humidity also is an integer. Visibility, we go back to float, and predictability looks like an integer. So I'm making estimations on which of these properties apply, but things with a decimal point get floats, and things that don't have decimal points are ints. All right, so we've got all these properties now created. I can now just delete all of this helper code that I had put in earlier. Now, what should we do with the rest of this? We've got the properties. We need some extra helpers. So let's make a constructor first of all. So let's go to generate a constructor. And let's select all of the properties and click OK. And that's a lot of properties, but fortunately they're all defined for us. That saves a lot of typing. We need getters and setters for all these guys, so let's do a generate and do getters and setters. And let's select everybody. Okay, now there's one other thing that we're going to use later. It's the toString method. So let's define one of these maybe at the, let's see, probably should go right here. Let's define the toString method. We can define that using generate as well. And let's see, toString. Now I'm going to click OK and select all of these. It's going to create one really long string. We're probably going to come back and eliminate some of these later because this is a lot of information. But for right now, that's a good valid toString method. Okay, so that defines a weather report model. So how are we going to make that work? Let's see, we've got ourselves a list problem and we need to make this thing void. I'm getting rid of all these errors. So we have now defined ourselves the weather report model, and we know that it's going to be a list of type. We're going to call it report. So now the next goal is to untangle this REST service data. And we want to be able to assign each one of these properties into one of the values of our weather report model. So let's first of all figure out what kind of request we're going to ask for. This very first line here has a curly bracket. So that indicates that this is a JSON object. The first property of a JSON object is called consolidated weather. That's the property, and this happens to be a list or an array, we'll call it. So we'll collapse this, and we can see that each item in our list has 15 properties, and that's the end of the list. So how many items are there? It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's a 6-day forecast. You notice that, so that the first day shows today's current date, which is May 25th. And then let's open the second item in the list, and you can see that that date is May 26th. And I bet you 27th is coming up next. Let's check, and sure enough. So this is a forecast for the next 6 days for the city of London. Now, we're going to only be interested in this property called consolidated weather. We are expecting an array. So this is 2 requests that we're going to have to get. We're going to have to get the object, the first object, and then the property of that object is an array. So let's see how this will go. All right, so now let's attack the problem here. So we know that we're expecting to get an object, and then we're going to get an array. All right, so let's pencil out what we're going to do because we need a roadmap. This is getting a little complex. So the first thing we need to do is get the JSON object from the request. And then we know that the item in that JSON object is called the consolidated weather, which is an array. And then each item in that array is an object that is going to give us all the properties of a weather report. So it will become a new object called weather report model. So that's where we're going. So first of all, let's get the JSON object, and then we can start from there. So let's take a look at what we did up here. So we have a request that looks like this here. So I'm going to start with a JSON array request and modify it. So let's just copy the first line. And since we are looking for an object, I'm going to modify here. So instead of JSON array request, it's supposed to be a JSON object request. And let's modify this. So JSON object request. And the results are going to be a JSON object, not a JSON array. Okay, we're going to put a close bracket there. So what's the problem? It says we're going to have an issue that says you probably haven't implemented your methods. So let's choose that. And we want the onResponse. So that comes out. And it says we are expecting a response of a JSON object. So compared to what we had before, this was a JSON array response. So we got one of each. All right, so we got an issue with the URL. So the URL is undefined. And let's fix the URL. So earlier we created a constant for the URL up here. We're going to make a new constant. So let's copy and paste this one. And let's call this thing query for city weather by ID. And then we're going to delete this and replace it with whatever comes from the documentation. So the URL that we're looking for, it looks like this up here. So I'm going to copy and paste from the address bar. So that's going to come into our new constant. Now the value here is the city's ID. So 44418, as I recall, was from London. So I'm going to just take that out and one of the slashes. So the URL now needs to have a definition. So let's type it in a string here and call it URL. And that's going to be the query for city by weather ID. And then we're going to have a plus, and we need to define it as an addition to this value here, the city ID. So concatenate those two together and you got yourself a URL. Okay, what do we got going here? This is supposed to have not a parentheses there. Okay, so this is looking like pretty good. We got ourselves the JSON response. All right, so we've got ourselves the response. Now, up above here, you notice we had this error listener thing, and we haven't implemented that down here. So let's add that. We're going to put in a comma and put in a new, what is it called? Response error listener. And that's the first suggestion, so I'll just press enter. And we still have something left over here. We need to close off this parentheses and then a semicolon. Okay, so all these callbacks really are difficult to keep track of. That's why people are trying to get away from so many nested events like this. But we've got ourselves a, looks like an event here that might be successful. We're going to at least get the consolidated weather now from the property in here. So let's check this out. We can probably get it. So let's make a toast for right now, just to test it out. And we are going to do the response dot toString. And I'm going to ignore the error part. And let's see what happens. This isn't complete, but we can at least test it. Come back into our main activity. What did we do wrong here? Okay, yeah, so this was... I'm going to just delete that and try again. So I'm going to try a weather data service dot get forecast by ID, and we're going to just put in the string 44418 because we know that is London. Okay, so that's simpler to test than what I was trying to do earlier. Let's see if it works. I'm going to run the app. All right, so the app's starting to start up. I'm going to come back into here. So what we're expecting is we're going to get a long list of items, and let's see what happens. So come on, app, we're ready to go. And I don't have to put anything in here. I've got 44418 as my default ID. And nothing at all. Okay, so I forgot something, obviously. Let's go check it out, and I think I know what it is. So in the data weather service, I created a request. Now, what's supposed to happen to that request after it was made? Does it automatically run? No, it doesn't. So just like up here, I have this get instance and add the request to the queue. I need to do that as well down at the bottom here. So I'm going to expect that to be the last thing I do and rerun the app. Okay, so you're getting to see how troubleshooting happens. You're probably going to commit the same errors that I'm making. So it's good to see the solutions as well as just good code. Okay, are we running yet? Here we go. Let's check the weather by ID. And anything? Whoa, look at that. We had a toast of quite a lot of text. So that to me looks like consolidated weather. It's showing all of the items that are in there. So it's producing the data we expect, but we're still not there. So I think maybe in the next video, I'm going to show you how to make a single request show only today's date, because I really don't want to show the entire forecast for the week. That's a little overwhelming. So we'll do that next. Hey, welcome back to our weather app. We're using API services from a weather service, and we're making an Android application. So if you're just joining us, go back and check out some of the previous videos. In this video, we're going to actually convert from this horrible looking toast, as you can see coming up here. It's got a lot of text. So this huge thing, this text, is going to be changed into a list that shows up in our list view. So that's where we're going. All right, so let's see if we can tame this thing. So we're trying to get the weather by ID, and we've got this long list of data. We're going to modify our request here. So we're into this weather data service class, and up until now we've been able to get the string here for the response. So this response here gave us the entire JSON object. Now I'm interested in just the first item, which is the class called the consolidated weather. So what I'm going to do is just pick out one of those things from the object. And we know it's a list of JSON things, JSON object things. So I'm going to define a list of JSON object, and I'm going to call it exactly the property that was in the API. It's called consolidated weather list. Now to get that, I'm going to have to go to the response, and I want to get a what? Get a JSON something. Sure enough, there is one that we can pick from called the JSON array. And the name of that is called consolidated weather. So hopefully that works. Now the hopefully part is where the computer says, no, you're not going to just hope for it. You have to surround this with a try catch, because if it doesn't work, I'm going to produce an error. All right, so now what do we got? Okay, so it didn't convert well here. So the problem is that it says you are requiring a list, and I found a JSON array. Well, maybe we can do this. We can just change this to a JSON array type. So let's go JSON array. Is that in there? JSON array. Okay, good. So now I've got the right data types. I got JSON array coming here, and the type that we're getting is a JSON array. Beautiful. Now, I only care about each item individually. So we're going to go loop through this and pull it out. But before we do the loop, let's just pull out the first item. All right, so what I'd like to do is create a new instance of the weather report model. Remember that model that has all the properties. And so I'm going to just say, hey, make me a new one. Now, I've got an error that says you can't make me a new one unless you provide me with all of these properties. Oh my goodness, that's a long constructor. Well, it could be done, and it would be one long line. So I'm going to cheat. I'm going to make another constructor that has no parameters. So let's go back to the weather report model, and I'm going to generate another constructor. So slip it in right here below the first constructor. Generate a constructor, and this time I'm going to not select anything. So let's see, just select the first item, and there it is. This is a null constructor, or an empty constructor. Let's see if that will work now. So now it's happy. It says you can create basically an empty weather report model. And then one by one I'm going to fill those items in. So I need to know the list of all of those items. So wow, this is a lot. So I might as well just copy the list here, and I'm going to dump it in right in this section, even though it's going to cause some errors. It's going to say, hey, I have no idea what those properties are. All right, so now I need an object that I can pull all these properties off of. So I have so far been able to get the JSON object response, and then I was able to get the consolidated weather list. So I know that the first item in the consolidated weather list is a JSON object. So let's do that. Let's go JSON object, and we'll call this thing first day from API, and he is going to be the consolidated weather list, and we're going to get item 0. Okay, did it work? So I know that I'm supposed to get the first item out of the list, and it's going to be a JSON object, but it isn't guaranteed to be a JSON object. So it says, do you want to cast this? If I put in the cast, it says I'm going to convert this into a JSON object. I think that'll work because in my service, the first item, let's take a check again. This is definitely the first item in the list is a JSON object. So the cast should have no problem at all. All right, so now how are we going to get all of these properties? So I'm trying to get first day to get a bunch of properties. So let's do first day dot set. And the first property is that I'm going to set is the ID. Now we're going to get the ID. What's going to come from the first day from the API dot get, and I'm going to choose the get item, and its value is ID. Okay, this is going to take a while, so just watch me type. All right, so this next process is quite tedious. We have to go and get all of the properties from the first day from API object, and we're going to assign those to one of the properties in our model, which is called first day. That's the instance. So you can see, I'm going to say, we're going to set the ID, and we're going to get it from the integer called ID in our API. And then they're going to set the weather state name, which is also from weather state name. So we're going to get these as mostly strings. So it's get string, get string, get string, get string. However, when we get down to the set min temperature, we are going to encounter a float. And it doesn't have an option apparently to get a float. So you could use probably get double or get long, either one of those, and it will correctly parse the value, which is a decimal number. And then we're going to assign it to our property, which is a float. So Java does allow you to cast a double or a long into a float. Now when we're all done here, we're going to have all the properties with the correct spelling. So make sure that they're all spelled exactly right. If one of them spelled wrong, it'll crash and we'll find the error, but it's better not to have that error, of course. Now since I've got all of these things typed in now, and hopefully you do too, I'm going to then delete all of these different properties that came from the class. And when we're done, we're going to have first day as the proper thing that's going to be returned. So to return it, that's the catch. We need to come up with another return type. So let's go and look at the Volley response listener. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to now use it in the next item. So I'm going to create another interface. And so the response listener now for the forecast. So we're going to call this thing maybe a forecast. Forecast by ID, response, and that is what's going to come down as my time to return. So instead of returning a string, I'm expecting it to return a single value called a weather report model. And let's just put him in there as the return type that we're going to hopefully play with at the end. Let's see, we have to tell it that we're going to expect this. So we're going to put in here the forecast response. So let's see, forecast by ID response. And let's see, forecast by ID response. Very good. And now here we can do forecast by ID response dot. On response, we're going to send back our first day. Man, that was a lot of work to get to there. But this will hopefully return it to our main activity. Okay, so the goal here is to send this first day response back. Let's check a few things up here. So here is a toast that sends the entire object. So I'm going to just comment that out. We don't need him anymore. That was for testing. Let's go to the main activity. And we need to now put in the response listener. So that's a new forecast. There it is, response. So let's check to see if on the response here, I want to do a toast here, and I want to bring back the, what was the object there? It's called weather report model. Let's see, weather report model, and we're going to do a toString. So if we're lucky, we're going to get a weather report, and if we're not so lucky, we'll put an error in. So let's put in a toast here, and we'll say something wrong here. And we'll have to figure out what that is in the error logs. Let's run it and see what happens. So I started up here and run, and let's try get weather by ID. And looks like I get nothing. So something didn't go well. So I'm going to come back into the code here. I'm going to switch to logcat. Let's see, where did logcat? There it is. And we've got an issue. Line number 89 and 83, and here is a message. No value for consolidated. So I spelled this wrong. Let's fix that. Let's see. Click on line 89. There it is, line 89, which is this here. So consolidated weather, I obviously spelled wrong. Let's copy consolidated weather from the code right there and overwrite my spelling error. Okay, let's try again. Okay, rerun and try it again. Okay, so all of this, here it is, get weather by ID, and we got a toast that shows all of the properties of that weather. So that's a lot of stuff, but it appears to be working correctly. Now, there's one more thing I'm going to change here before we're done, and this city ID, and we hard-coded a city ID, and where was that at? So right here, we're going to do the city ID is not from 44418. I'm going to get it from the edit text data input and get the text and change it to a string. So now we should be able to get weather for anybody and anyone that the service knows about. So let's check it out. I'm going to try putting in London, and I'm going to try to put in some other names. Let's see, 44418, get the weather by the ID, and sure enough, there it is. Now I wanted to know what the, let's try some other city. Let's go with Phoenix again, and get the ID number. Oh man, I don't remember how to copy that, so let's come back into our API and see if we can get an ID number. So let's see, London, let's change that to Phoenix so we can get an ID number. There it is. So I'm going to copy this 247-1390 and put it right into my ID there. Let's see, can I paste it? No, I can't. Let's try it. 247-1390. I got that right? And what do we have? There it is. I've got ourselves a number that seems to be valid. If I put in an invalid number, I'm going to add a 9. What do we get? And anything? Anything at all? Appears that it doesn't work. So it's causing an error. Anyway, if I put in a correct number, I've got myself a weather report. Okay, we're getting further along. We're going to now create a list of stuff here, and we'll show not just the first day, but all of the days of the weather. But this video is already long enough, so we'll save that for the next. Next up is to create a list of the forecast. Hey, welcome back to another part for our Weather API app. In the last video, we were able to create a service that would give us the weather ID for the first day of the report. So you can see that this list here is for Phoenix, and when I choose Get Weather by ID, I get 1 day. So the first thing says light clouds, and that's what it says here. So what our goal is now is to take the report here and show all of these reports and put them in a list. Okay, so to create this list, we're going to have to modify the type of data that is sent back from our service. So let's go look at the service that was created, called the Weather Data Service. And this thing is supposed to get an entire list, and right now it just does something called first day. As you can see from our code here, this line here says just get me the first day. So what I'd like to do now is to get the entire loop of the list of things. So first day is rather misleading. I'm going to name this as 1 day. So let's do a refactor and rename, and I'm going to call this thing 1 day. Let's see if I can get it right. 1 day. Let's call it 1 day weather. All right. Now, instead of 0, we're going to do the loop. All right, so I want to make a for loop that's going to go from 0 to the length of the list. And remember, the length of the list is consolidated weather list.length. And then instead of getting just one item, we're going to go through all the lists. All right, so let's do a couple of changes here. I have a problem with spelling consolidated weather, so I'm going to change this to the word consolidated, spelled correctly, and then paste over the others. Okay, instead of item 0, it should be item I. So if you remember, up at the top of my class here, I have a list already. It's called report. And so let's change that maybe to the word report. So I'm going to rename that, and let's call it weather report models, something plural so we know it's a list. Now down at the end of the list, we're going to add one. All right, so we're going to add 1 day weather to the weather report models. Now when we get to the callback, instead of responding with just one item, we're going to talk to the entire list. Okay, so that's going to break something. It's going to say that your callback is not designed for a list. It was designed for a single item. So let's go and change our list up here. So our callback is supposed to give us a list of weather report models. All right, so it's going to do weather report models, and then the response here is going to hopefully match with that. Now let's go back into change in the main activity. Let's fix it as well here. So this is supposed to capture an entire list of things. So let's change this to a list of weather report models, and let's call this thing our same idea. So weather report models, and then we're going to import the class. Okay, so now we have ourselves the list here. Instead of doing a toast, we are going to now include this as part of our list view. So we need a layout adapter. Okay, so now we have to create two things. First of all, we have to create an array adapter and then assign that array adapter to the list view. So the array adapter is a class that contains a few properties. First of all, the context has to be set. So we'll use main_activity.this for the context. And then we're going to dig into a predefined array adapter type. So type in android.r.layout.simpleListItem1. So there are other different types of simple list adapters we can pick, but I always go to this one. It seems to work fine. This is not something that I defined. It's something that was predefined as something given to us in Android. The last item in the list is the actual list that's going to be chosen for the values. And then we simply set the adapter here into, so let's switch back into the consolidated weather page where we can see the actual number come up. And I'm going to type in a number here. So let's use the exact same number that was given to us. So this is 2471390, which is Phoenix, and choose Get Weather by ID. And there it is. So this is a one item in the list. That's two items, three. So it's not very easy to read, but we do have a list. Let's fix it up so it's easier to read. I'm going to go back and change the model to string. So let's go into the model here, so the weather report model. So let's just fix this up a little bit. Let's get rid of some of these things. So like the ID, we can get that out of the way. And let's see, the weather state. I'm seriously just going to remove most of this stuff here. So we'll get the weather state name. And then what else do we want? Let's create, I don't really care. The date is important. So let's put in the word date and a colon. And let's see the maximum temperature, and let's just go with those. So take everybody else out. And that shortens things up quite a bit. So instead of min, I'm going to change it to low. For max, I'm going to change it to high. So I'm shortening things down. You can make this say pretty much whatever style you want. It's just a string. And let's fix it. All right, so let's see what that does. See if it's any better. Let's run it. And we'll get a shorter view for each item in the list. Okay, so let's bring this back up again so I can see this number. Let's type in a number for 2471390 and get the weather. So I'm getting 6 different weather reports, but they're all showing for the day 5:30. And so that doesn't seem quite right. Let's go check it out. 5:30. Sure enough, it says heavy clouds. And I don't understand why it's showing just the last one. Okay, coming back into the code here, I realized I did something a little bit odd. So this here was left over from the previous iteration of my program. I created the object, and then I started the for loop. So I'm going to cut this out and put it inside the for loop. So we recreate a new one each time we go through the loop. So we create a new object, and then at the end we add it. So let's see if that helps at all. And the weather report model, I'm going to fix up a little bit here. So I'm going to change, we don't need to have this listed here like that. Let's take that out and let's see if that works any better. All right, so it looks like this is working better. I put in the ID number for Phoenix, and I get the report. So it could probably be formatted a little bit better. I need a space in here. So the toString method isn't that pretty, but it could be improved upon. So what we're going to do next then is, instead of just showing the number here, which is impossible for me to remember except for the one, I think it was 444118, which was London. And then beyond those two cities, I don't remember any of them. So for the last video, or the last section we're going to have to do is create this button here called Weather by Name. And so we'll put in the name of the city, such as London, and that will generate the list of data that we have in front of us here, instead of trying to remember the city's ID number. So that's coming up next. Hey, welcome back to another video for our Weather API demo. In the previous videos, we were able to get a list of data from the cities. Now, instead of typing in the city number, I'm going to actually be able to create this view by looking at the city name. So in this section, we're going to modify the function here, or the method, for getCityName. Right now, it just tells me what I typed. So let's fix that. So let's go back into the code here, and we are going to add a new item in the report. So in a previous video, we created a promise down here. I'm going to uncomment that promise. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to change this to void. And we are going to get the city forecast if the person gives us the city name. So we were able to get the values out of this thing if we were using the ID number. So that's not very convenient. So we're going to have to change this to get by the city name. So here's the strategy. We're going to call twice to the API to get our values. So the first is we are going to get the city ID given the name. We were able to do that earlier. Then we are going to fetch the city forecast if we have the city ID. So we're basically combining the two functions that we've already created. All right, so to start off here, we're going to call the function called getCityID. And we can provide it with the city name because that's given to us in the parameter above here. Now, the response that is given from this function is a Volley response listener. And so we'll create a new instance of that. And so we'll have two different responses to handle. One is on error and the other is on response. So inside of response, we can now claim that we have the city ID. So that's what this function just got to us. Now we're going to turn around and call a second function, which is getForecastById. This method also has a response. It's called forecastById response. So this callback is also going to happen. And then when we get to the onResponse item, we have a promise that we can make that says we have the weather report. And we can send that back to the main activity. So we're starting to see nested callbacks here. This is where people start calling it callback hell because we can lose track of the parentheses and brackets very easily. It's confusing. All right, so now we have this claim here that we have the weather report. Now we have to create another response and a callback to make this work. So let's define one at the top here. All right, so we're going to create the interface that's going to define the callback. So I'm just going to use it a name that matches closely to this function, call it getCityForecastByName callback. And the same two different types of things are promised in here in the interface. We're going to have an onError and an onResponse. The response, of course, is the important one. We want to respond with a list of weather report models. Now that we have the callback defined, we can go add it to our function. So we're going to say that we're expecting to see a callback called getCityForecastByName callback. Once that's defined, we can come down into our method on the response from the previous callback and call this one. So we're going to do get callback, and we're going to say onResponse, and we are going to then reply with this thing called weather report models. Okay, that should reply correctly. So now let's go back into our main activity, and we can probably duplicate a lot of the things that we did from the previous guy. So let's just copy and paste, and we will modify. So we got ourselves here. Instead of get by ID, we're going to say get city by name, and we're expecting a different reply. And so we've got ourselves here the list. And I think the weather report models should come back as we expect them to. Wow, that was a lot of code, but let's see if it works. Okay, we're up and running, so let's put in a city, and let's hide the keyboard and choose get by name. So hopefully London will now populate a list of items, and we're getting nothing. So, oh, it did come up. So it just took a little while. So why was it so slow? Well, it's slow because we're calling the API twice. Let's see if it's just as slow if we type in another city and see what happens. So that one came up quite a bit faster. So they're getting light rain in Kansas City. And let's see what's going on in Lima, down there in South America. Looks to me like it's running. So we've got ourselves get by ID, or get the city ID. As you can see, it shows up. And if I try to get the ID, I have to actually put in the number here. So let's put in 44418. Let's see, one more extra 4 there. So we can show London. And that seems to work. And then finally, we're able to put in a number or a name here. So let's try New York. and see what the weather is in New York. And there it is. They have clouds. So we've got ourselves a finished app. This here is quite complex. It shows us how to use the API service, shows us how to use callbacks, and it shows us how to work with a singleton. So several different things that are now new to your toolbox in your Java programming kit. So please leave your comments below to see if there's any criticisms or any suggestions which you would have to make this look better. So I think the first thing that I would do is, instead of using a simple list adapter, I would create more of a complex one. In the API instructions, they're strongly encouraging us to use icons. And so if you look back at their page here, you can see they've got all these icons that you should probably put into your app, and you can show them as pictures instead of just text in your forecast. So there's lots of things that you can improve, but this is a good start. So thanks for watching. And if you like the channel, go ahead and subscribe and look at some of the other items. There's not only Android programming here, but there's C#, there's PHP, a lot of work with databases and computer security. So a lot of things to learn here. And if you're interested in studying at Grand Canyon University, look us up online and you can see some of these activities are actually taught in the classroom. So we'll see you soon.